Welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Chad and I'm joined here today with my colleague, Velina, and we're coming to you as part of your Adler Wellness team, presenting self-compassion. What is it? It's the antidote for perfectionism. We'll see how this goes, all right? So what do we have in store for you today? This is a little bit of an overview of what today's webinar is going to be like. Just a heads up, this webinar is being recorded at the moment, and the link should be accessible to you after the presentation. So if you want to review the webinar when you have time, or if you want to share it with individuals that you think might benefit from it, you have that link at the end of the presentation. It's also helpful to have a link and have this saved in whatever way you can, so that you don't have to write any notes down, or you don't have to, this doesn't feel like school. You can just pay attention, you can just absorb what's going on and how are you relating to the information that we're presenting. That being said, what are we going to present? We're going to look at what perfectionism is, and not just the textbook definition of it, but how it shows up in psychological literature, how it shows up in our studies. We're going to look at the effects of perfectionism, and then we're going to see how that ties into self-compassion, which is a construct that is helpful for many things, including helping with perfectionism that is a little too maladaptive. So we're going to look at common myths. We're going to look at...
Oh, Chad, you're muted.
There you go. And then we're going to look at why it's important. Okay. We're also going to really dive into the relationship between self-compassion and perfectionism. And then, as you know, there's going to be some barriers when you start a new practice. And so we're going to look at what those barriers are, and then we're going to dive into some skills. How's that sound? Cool. So when it comes down to perfectionism, researchers have found two types of perfectionism. And that is personal standards perfectionism. And this goes by many names. In the research, the ones that seem to be more common is personal standards. This describes the setting and the striving of high standards and goals for oneself. So this is not necessarily perfectionism that we tend to look at as maladaptive. In fact, this is actually a good thing. Adaptive perfectionism in moderation can be quite motivating and drives you to succeed. Now, on the flip side, there's what we call self-critical perfectionism, which involves harsh self-scrutiny and overcritical self-evaluations, along with chronic worry about criticism and approvals of others. So it's almost like if you see this picture right here, the one on the left, they're looking at the house and it looks beautiful, but they're not satisfied. Whereas the other person, they feel accomplished. They're like, this is what I can do right now. So we're going to dive a little bit more into what adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism is. And if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. Your video and your audio will be turned off just for your privacy's sake, okay?
Okay, thanks, Chad. So yeah, as Chad mentioned, there's two types of perfectionism, and I'm just going to go into them a little bit more, kind of give a good idea, maybe examples of what they might look like. So let's start with adaptive perfectionism, the thing that we all want to do, I guess. So everyone has high standards, like everybody, like you, me, Chad, everyone in this room has high standards for themselves.
Yeah.
But not everyone experiences adjustment problems because of these high standards. Not everyone feels depressed or anxious because of the standards we have of ourselves. So there are several things that kind of determine or like predict whether or not you're going to have these adjustment problems. And I'm going to talk about those things. So when individuals have high personal standards, but at the same time, they have an idea of like, okay, they have a goal. For example, I thought of what goal I'm gonna give. So I
Yeah.
started kettlebells. Okay, I'm starting with kettlebell swings. So bad at them. I want to do this like Turkish get up thing. It's like it looks very impressive. I am nowhere close to it, right?
Yeah.
In order to do it, a couple of things. I need to have a plan of how I'm going to get there. If I tell myself I'm going to do the Turkish get up in 3 months and I do not have a plan, when I don't achieve that goal, that's going to be like, it's going to be, we're going to talk about that maladaptive perfectionism. But one of the things I need in order to achieve my goal would be a sense of orderness, like order, right? Like I need to know how I'm going to get there and what muscles do I need to build, what the timeline is going to look like, right? And another, I think, component or thing that's important is understanding my capabilities, right? Can I lift this kettlebell? Do I need to build other muscles first? Do I have a good understanding of weight training? Do I have good body awareness? Should I go to some yoga classes to like learn body awareness first, right? And then another aspect is discipline. Like I have these goals, I understand my capabilities, but how much discipline do I have to reach this goal? These are some of the things that's very important. Like high standards are great, but you also need that to be accompanied with, again, order, understanding your capabilities, understanding where you're at in order to get to where you want to be. And I think another important piece of like adaptive perfectionism is that like, yep, all of us have high standards, but like things could go two ways. In 3 months, I could try the Turkish get up, right? And let's say my thing is like, I'm going to be so perfect that when someone looks at this Turkish get up that I'm going to do, they're going to be like, wow, like this is it. She is the person that I want to be like. Or someone could be like, you know what, you could do this better. Two things here. One way I could go is like, oh, the person doesn't think my Turkish get up is perfect, or I don't think my Turkish get up is perfect. What now? Does that mean I'm a worthless person? Does that mean I'm bad at all exercises? Should I stop exercising? Or can I be like, guess my 3 month timeline and my discipline and my goal wasn't as good as it should have been. So
Yeah.
if I had fused or like jumped on the train of like, I'm shitty, everything's horrible, I would not probably try this Turkish get up again. I'm going to be like, I'm going to go home, never go to the gym, hide in the room. But if I don't fuse with those thoughts, if I'm like, oh, this is just like productive criticism of like how I can improve, then I'm more likely to try again, adjust my goals, go back to the drawing board and start again and still try to achieve this high personal standards that I have, but without attributing my like imperfection as like a personal defect.
Yeah.
So that's adaptive perfectionism.
Uh,
And then,
oh,
go
that's
ahead.
I really like that the whole exercise comparison, because oftentimes, we watch, working out from home, you're watching a lot of these YouTube videos and a lot of Instagram workout videos, and you see these magnificent people with like these exercise, they look so good, and you're like, oh my God, like they're doing this at their home and they look so great. And like I'm realizing when I'm working out from home, or like I'm working out in general, I'm realizing I'm like, am I living to my realistic standards, or am I using theirs? It's like, well, if their whole life is them working out, of course they're gonna look like that, and it's not realistic for me. If that makes sense. I know, like that's the kind of what came up for me when you talked about the kettlebell exercises. And then you start seeing it as like your own personal defects. Like I can't. Well, how come I can't do that? How come I can't do this? There must be something wrong with me.
Yeah, love that you mentioned that though, because we're going to talk about like locus of control in a bit. Love that you
Yes.
mentioned that.
Interesting.
Okay, so next slide. Thank
Cool.
you. Okay, so then on the other side, or the other end of the spectrum, we have self-critical or maladaptive perfectionism. This is the type of perfectionistic that's most linked with like adverse side effects, right? So self-critical or maladaptive perfectionism is defined this way. It's the continued pursuit of high standards despite negative consequences to mental and or physical well-being, because there's this belief that like our self-worth is defined by achievement of these standards. So just simple stuff can be like, if I don't know, if I don't work 9 hours a day, my boss is not going to like me. If I don't clean the house, cook the food, whatever, my partner is going to think I'm useless, right? So a lot of like, this is an example of like how a lot of times, like even in like, I could be like, if I don't do the Turkish get up, like I should just go home, never go to the gym again. I should stop weight training, right? Things like that, where I feel like so much of my self-worth is again fused with achievement that's external, right? And so when these things happen, like when we attribute our self-worth to our achievements and we don't achieve those things, or our goals are unmet or met in a way that we are not happy with, a lot of times what can happen is like we're less likely to want to try, right? We get into things like procrastination cycles. Like you have an assignment due, and maybe in the past you did some assignment that you didn't score so well in. So the next time an assignment comes along, you're going to be like, oh, I'm not going to do well. I'm not going to try, because what's the point? There's no point. And so you're less likely to put it off instead of being like, oh, I didn't do so well. What are the things I can do better this time? You might stop our task halfway. So Chad and I were talking before the presentation, just preparing. He's like, you should give examples of your life. And you know what? There's the adaptive perfectionism, but like there is totally maladaptive perfectionism.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Chad, I bought this diamond painting. Okay. It's like paint by numbers, but you put like little like beads, okay, on the painting. And I got this during like early pandemic, like 2 years ago. I was like, yeah, I'm going to finish this in a month. I'm going to put it up on my wall. It's going to be so great. I'm going to be so artistic and creative. I've done this much, like a tiny square of the whole painting, and it's 2 years later.
Yeah.
And I've stopped doing it because so much of my sense of self-worth was like attributed to like, if I don't do this right, I'm not a creative person.
Yeah.
So for a while, I was telling myself, you're not creative enough. You're not creative. And the other day I was like, don't worry about that. Just do it. Do 30 minutes. It doesn't matter if you're not creative. Eventually you'll finish. Maybe it'll take you 5 years. That's totally okay. And social isolation, right? Like I'm not hiding in the room because I can't finish this like painting, but think of an example of like maybe an exam, like a big exam, and you tell everybody like, I'm going to pass. And when you don't, you're now thinking like, I didn't pass, I'm useless, I'm worthless, I'm good for nothing. And so sometimes we kind of project our feelings onto other people, thinking like they feel the same way about us that we do. And then we feel shame. And like everyone here probably has felt shame. So, you know, when you feel shame, it makes you want to hide, like cover your face, leave, isolate. And so social isolation can be a big piece of maladaptive perfectionism. Yeah. Not only that, like we tend to avoid situations that's going to make us feel bad about ourselves, like situations where there's achievement of goal-oriented tasks, because we're like, we can't do it. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, like, sure, the anxiety in the moment is relief, but we do miss out on a lot of opportunities that we otherwise would have had if we didn't fuse with this like feelings of worthlessness, you know, when we don't achieve something. Mm-hmm. And so with self-critical or maladaptive perfectionism, individuals tend to report not feeling good enough. Like they feel like there's a huge mismatch between their standards and abilities. And Chad said earlier, like, you know, that painting of like that little cartoon where the guy did a pretty good painting. So much of like, when you treat life with like, or you see like your self-worth tied to how you perform, and you repeat yourself, you're not good enough, nothing you do is ever going to be good enough. Even if someone else can objectively say it like, this is perfect, to you, it's going to be not good enough. Mm-hmm. And so maladaptive perfectionism kind of puts you in a cycle where this happens. You feel not good enough. Even though you're not good enough, you're going to feel not good enough. You procrastinate and you don't feel good enough. And then more fusion of like, I'm worthless. I never get anything done. I'm never good enough. Yeah, like that's what I have to say for this slide. Anything to add, Chad?
It's just so easy to get into that cycle, that vicious cycle of like, once you have sort of like a core belief of I'm not good enough, it kind of paints the picture, a broad stroke over everything that you set yourself out to do or try to accomplish. And the anxiety gets so overwhelming that you're like, screw it, I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Tell us about locus of control.
Yeah, talking about locus of control. Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a lengthy slide. I'm going to explain a lot of stuff. If you don't understand, put it in the chat. I'll try my best to answer it now or later towards the end of the presentation. So first, let's talk about locus of control, okay? This is a concept we use a lot with clients. Locus of control exists, like think of it as a spectrum. On one end, we have an internal locus of control. On the other hand, we have the external locus of control. And with any spectrum, that's always going to be people falling on like all ranges, right? Like some people be right in the middle. Someone who's in the middle would use internal, external locus of control depending on the situation, depending on what fits, right? They adapt to the situation. Think of those people that way. And so I'm going to start with one end of the spectrum, which is internal locus of control. So in studies, like Kelly talked, this person, Kelly in 2016 did the study, and she explained how people with internal locus of control, and part of the literature also like looks up to people with internal locus of control, but I'm kind of just like play devil's advocate and kind of question that a little bit as well, Chad, and like everyone here. So internal locus of control is someone who feels responsible for everything, right? What does that mean, right? So for example, if they set a goal, they feel like they're the only factor in whether or not they achieve the goal. Like the Turkish get up, like I'm the only person in charge, like my discipline, me, like sort of ignoring external factors. And that's good sometimes, right? Because on the bright side of having internal locus of control is that like, even if things are falling apart around you, there's this sort of like high self-esteem of like, I can do this, I can go through and like persevere and I can reach my goal or achieve this or that. But I think sometimes the downside of that is like when you take responsibility for everything while disregarding environmental factors, like maybe because of I have to practice the Turkish gap every week. Maybe I have PhD webinars to prepare for every week and I have no time. And ignoring that means that I'm only thinking of myself as like, you have poor time management. That's why you didn't achieve this goal, right? Even though unforeseen things came up and like, oh, someone was like, you have to do all the webinars. And I was like, oh no. So when I do that, when I'm only focused on all the things I did wrong, we tend to like have lots of self-critical thoughts like, this is your fault. This is all on you. Nothing else. Don't blame other people. So like it's good, but also then we have lots of self-critical thoughts. Now, when we look at external locus of control, I think this is explained as like people who tend to really look to environmental factors in like figuring out or deciding whether they can achieve their goal. These are the kinds of people that are like, oh, this is fate, this is destiny, like outside things. Like for example, I could be like, yeah, it's all the webinars that made me not be able to do the Turkish get up. I had no part in this, right? And it can be good and bad. Like I know people tend to see it as all bad, but like think about it this way. If a situation really genuinely like happened where you had no control and that hindered you from reaching your goal, having an external locus of control at that time can be so useful because you can objectively see the truth. Like I didn't get to my goal because I had webinars, because I had exams, like I could not do it because those things took priority. But on the I guess the downside of it is like you feel a lack of control. Like you might feel all the time that like nothing I do matters because other things are going to affect it anyway. Other people are going to get in the way. The weather is going to get in the way. I don't know, I'm going to get hit by a car, maybe things I can't control, which can cause anxiety sometimes, feeling like you have no control over your life. So Bill, thanks for that super long spiel. How does that relate to perfectionism? So this is a meta-analysis that this person did. So there's a lot of studies included in this one study. So one study, when they looked at perfectionists versus non-perfectionists, people that don't score high on like perfectionistic scales, they found that perfectionists in general had higher internal locus of control scores, right? They tend to attribute things to themselves, okay? Let's just look at like perfectionists versus non-perfectionists, non-perfectionists being the control. So yeah, they feel like they're responsible for everything. And I kind of talked about the downsides of that, right? Like feeling like if you don't achieve something, that's all on you. And then in other studies, they found that like they only looked at perfectionists. They didn't look at non-perfectionists. So now we're like zooming in a little bit, right? When we look at perfectionists, adaptive perfectionists versus maladaptive perfectionism, individuals who endorse maladaptive perfectionism had high scores on the external locus of control, right? Feeling a lack of control, feeling like there are outside forces that control them, that no matter how hard they try, they're not going to get where they're going to be because of all these outside things that's just going to like F things up, you know? So when I was reading it, I was like, oh, that's so contradictory. What does that mean? But like at the end of the paper, this person talks about how individuals who endorse perfectionistic traits, but don't have high scores on internal or external. So that means they kind of fall in the normal range. They kind of fall in the middle. They didn't have adverse symptoms. And it's kind of like being in the middle is really helpful here because then you pick and choose what's helpful. I could be like, oh, there was a lot of like unforeseen webinars and exams that came up, so I couldn't do my Turkish get. But also, I could have been more disciplined, I guess. I could have time managed better. And so when I integrate both those things, it's easier for me because I have a sense of control, but I can also give up control for things that I had no responsibility over, right? So then this again comes back to like, when we're able to adjust to our unmet expectations on standards, we're more likely to have better mental health outcomes, right? We're better able to be like, oh, this happened. What can I do now? Versus like, oh, doom is me. I'm screwed. I'm never going to achieve anything. And that was a long, long explanation. If you have any questions, please put that in chat. If you have anything to add.
Thanks, Bill. So not surprisingly, here's all of the lists. And this is just from 2014 to 2020 of all of the effects of maladaptive perfectionism. Over time, it can show up as depressive symptoms, anxiety, greater stress over time, burnout, eating disorders, physiological symptoms, social anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders. Oh, that's already there. Addiction, so many other things can be caused by maladaptive perfectionism. This is not surprising. Freud actually talked about perfectionism in his early writings when he was writing about the id, ego, and the superego. He demonstrated that, well, not demonstrated, but he theorized that people, all of us, have a drive. We have a drive that's psychological and that is biological. A drive to, what do you think it is? To survive. And usually perfectionism, in his view, comes from when our drive is not aligned with what reality is or what their perception of reality is. And so he believed that a lot of mental health problems really stems from that, stems from what you want to do versus what you're actually capable of doing. To make it oversimplified, so you can get all of these different symptoms from not symptoms, but effects from maladaptive perfectionism. Now, not surprisingly, nursing and mental health in general, and healthcare and mental health care in general can lead to quite a bit of burnout. Nursing is regarded as a high-risk occupation for experiencing burnout. And as many of us understand, when you make a mistake in a healthcare field and even in the mental health care field, it really affects other people's lives. Unlike other occupational groups, nurses' mistakes can directly impact patients' safety and medical outcomes. Of course, we have to look at organizational factors that contribute to burnout. But maladaptive perfectionism is also one big factor in how it ties into burnout. I mean, we're talking about locus of control. One thing that's in your control is maladaptive perfectionism, is how you relate to your own maladaptive perfectionistic tendencies. If organizational factors is something that you can't really do something about, maybe short term, the one thing you can do right now is to work on your maladaptive perfectionistic tendencies. So not surprisingly, maladaptive perfectionism, much like the previous slide, can lead to burnout. And what researchers found is that nurses with maladaptive perfectionism often keep their problems to themselves. There's a real risk that if they share their problems to their colleagues or their supervisors, that they might get in a whole lot of trouble. And so there's that. And then there's also, they keep it to themselves because they cannot admit their own failures to others. So there's that whole social comparison thing that Bill was talking about earlier. And so this study by Chang, 2012, looked at perfectionism and burnout. And they found that was true for nurses, that of the 314 nurses, they found that nurses with maladaptive perfectionism tend to avoid negative emotions. And when they tend to avoid negative emotions, that often leads to burnout. So when I say tend to avoid negative emotions, it's almost like a denial of like, nope, nothing's wrong. I'm all right. I'm going to keep going. I got to stop being weak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what other maladaptive perfectionistic beliefs might people hold? Well, here are some. My mistakes reflect that I'm not smart. I dwell on mistakes that reflect my self-worth. Your mind can tell you all these different things. My self-worth is contingent on meeting a standard. Bill talked about that earlier with her kettlebell exercise. I want to be perfect because I am afraid to fail. Since I'm afraid to fail, I want to avoid challenges. I need to be number one to prove my smartness. It's interesting because people often go, I'm either mediocre or perfectionist or perfect, right? There's a whole spectrum in between. What's it like when someone calls you average? Oh, it hurts. It's like, yeah, he's all right. Like he's got all these qualities, but he's kind of average. He's kind of an average guy. That kind of hurts. It's like, why does that feel so stingy, right? What's so bad about being average? What about above average? Or what about just in that ballpark, right? That 50 percentile of just being an average person. No, we often like to think of us as either mediocre or I'm perfect. And that's something that we all share from time to time. It's just recognizing when that comes up for you. If you have adaptive perfectionistic beliefs, you might think that, hey, I can learn from my mistakes and improve. My self-worth is not contingent on meeting a set of standards. I am a valuable person beyond my performance. You have other areas in your life that you derive value from and satisfaction. I want to be perfect because I want to succeed, not because I don't want to fail, but because I want to succeed. It's like glass half full type of mentality. And since I want opportunities to succeed, I seek opportunities where I am stretched. I thrive under challenge. I thrive under pressure. I am satisfied with meeting a personal goal. Once you achieve a personal goal, personal, not the one that Instagram, that I see on Instagram, I'm like, I need to be that person. No, it's like, I need to be this person for myself. And I'm satisfied with that. Now, there's a really popular book called The Mindset by Carol Dweck, The New Psychology of Success. I encourage everyone to read this book, but basically it ties into adaptive perfectionistic beliefs is having a growth mindset, is believing that, hey, I can grow from these mistakes. Whereas maladaptive is people that often have a fixed mindset, that whatever capabilities I have is fixed. And I'm born with whatever capabilities I have. And that's so tied into your self-worth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So we're going to go into some common myths with self-compassion. One thing, and that I still kind of don't believe that's a myth, is that self-compassion undermines motivation. If I'm self-compassionate, if I love myself, if I just let myself off the hook, then my motivation will go down. Actually, self-compassion over time sustains our motivation in the long term. It equips us with a way to deal with adversity and move from what I call a growth, what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So
Okay.
realizing that you're not just fixed in where you're at, but you're also able to grow from the mistakes that you've made, or just to figure out challenges and how to learn from those. Self-compassion, it's a myth that self-compassion means letting yourself off the hook. And here's a picture of a hook. That's a myth. Admitting that we're human beings and that we make mistakes sometimes, and that we're all doing the best that we can, and being compassionate to ourselves in the face of our own failures and mistakes, actually allow us to take more responsibility for our actions. So there's a study actually that, and Bill talked about this earlier before, but some people who are self-compassionate tend to feel more guilt than shame. People with maladaptive perfectionistic tendencies tend to feel ashamed because they feel like they're not meeting up to the standards of what society tells them or what other people tell them. When you feel guilt, it's more about what your personal standards are. Well, I'm going against my own values. So when I say guilt, that's a lot different than when I experience shame. Does that kind of rings a bell? Okay. There's another study that shows that when people are instructed to be self-compassionate, when thinking about a past mistake or failure, they're likely to accept personal responsibility for what happened rather than blaming things on other people or other events. So self-compassion is really not about letting yourself off the hook. It's about admitting a mistake or admitting that you're in pain or you're suffering and doing something about it. And Bill will talk more about what that means later. One thing as well is self-compassion is self-indulgent. That's not true. As I said, it's admitting something and then doing something about it. So admitting that something is wrong or something that you're suffering or that you're struggling or fill in the blank and doing something about it. It's not giving up. So it's the opposite. The last thing is often people think of self-compassion as the same thing as self-esteem. When we think of self-esteem, it refers to how we evaluate ourselves positively, and the degree to which we evaluate ourselves positively. It represents how much we like or value ourselves, and it's based on comparisons with others. That's different than self-compassion, because self-compassion is a way of relating to ourselves. And Bill will talk more about components of self-compassion in the next slide.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah. So self-compassion is a big thing, and people who have studied this have kind of broken it up into three components, right? So the first one is mindfulness versus over-identification. So mindfulness is, the act of watching ourselves, of noticing what's going on for us without necessarily hooking onto the thoughts. So like think of like thoughts coming up in your mind and you like put some hooks and like walk on the backs of them, or you can be like, nah, I'm gonna let that pass. And mindfulness is watching things happen for you, good or bad, right? And I think a lot of the times what causes suffering in us, like when we have a negative thought, negative belief come up, we like choose to believe this negative thought, and then we descend down the spiral staircase of this negative thought, right? That's over identification. So mindfulness is noticing like, oh, I'm having lots of negative thoughts right now, right? What do I do? So Chad said, like, notice, feeling these things, what can I do about it now, right? So mindfulness is kind of the first step. Mindfulness is the first step for everything, shocking when I first found out. And then the next component is self-kindness versus self-judgment. And I think a lot of us are just really worried about being kind to ourselves. Like Chat was saying, like, what if I'm too kind to myself? What if I'm letting myself off the hook? What if I'm just slacking by being kind to myself? And like he said, kindness is useful, right? Because I was talking about earlier, when we judge ourselves, that leads to more procrastination, more burnout, more like premature termination of things. Like there is really no positive really to judging ourselves negatively and harshly. So one of the components of self-compassion is that self-kindness, that piece of, how people always say, treat yourself the way you would treat your loved one, right? Like, yeah, if you're kind to your loved one, then you are your loved one too, right? So that self-kindness piece is pretty important in self-compassion. And now this interdependence versus isolation is, I think, one of my favorites in self-compassion. So this interdependence or common humanity is like a big piece of self-compassion. It's recognizing that you are human. And so I'm human, Chad's human. If I have shame or guilt about an experience, Chad has likely felt the same feelings, right? I've made mistakes, Chad has made mistakes, like every one of us here has made mistakes. And so kind of connecting or recognizing and understanding this common humanity piece of like, I've made a mistake, but so has everyone else. I feel shame and guilt, like I'm not the only one. Isolation is that, just like when you're, that little gremlin in your brain that tells you you're the only one who ever like F something up like this. You're the only one who feels so ashamed, like no one else feels this way. But like, not to be like, oh, invalidating your feelings here, but like everyone feels those emotions, right? At varying levels and degrees. But more often than not, someone else has felt the same like dark thoughts or dark feelings that we've had. And sort of understanding that like we're all united by our humanness is very like a big piece of self-compassion, because if you can be compassionate towards someone else, then you can, like you have the ability to like have that towards yourself as well.
And like, kind of reminds me like Vil and I were in our clinical psychology degree, and we do therapy as well as assessments as part of our training. And in the past, we do group therapy. And it's quite interesting and really a privilege to see whenever our clients get together and share stories and recognize that, oh my goodness, like they were going through something very similar than I am. I don't feel alone. And it almost normalizes human suffering. It's a weird thing to even say that it normalizes human suffering, because of course everyone struggles, right? But it's really hard to see that when you feel and take things way too personally. You over-identify too much with your suffering. And this is what depression is, isn't it? Like you isolate yourself, you go home, you think that everything is happening to you because you're cursed. And you really wallow in that self-pity. So it's really quite interesting when we saw earlier what the effects of perfectionism is. It really ties into some of these depressive and anxiety symptoms, and seeing that self-compassion is about recognizing a common humanity and being kind to yourself. This is what we mean when we say self-compassion is the antidote for perfectionism. Again, this is not surprising then, given that our whole presentation so far has been talking about the negative effects of perfectionism, and now we're talking about, well, why is self-compassion important? Because it deals with those negative effects of perfectionism. It deals with that anxiety that we feel. It deals with that fixed mindset that I talked about earlier. It leads to greater psychological well-being, decreased stress over time, better for your body, better for your mind. And over time, in the long term, you tend to feel better. You tend to live a life that's more guided by your values. And then you look good while doing it. It's better physical health. This is a picture that I believe we've presented at some point in these webinars. And if it's not, it's a pretty, it's what we call the mental health continuum model. Now, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but essentially, when we're being mindful, we start recognizing some of the effects that stress, burnout, and perfectionism can have on us. And we start noticing things like excessive anxiety, irritability, exhaustion, physical illness. Self-compassion takes you away from that top part of this table and then moves into actions to take each phase of the continuum. So self-compassion is one way to do that. Recognizing where you fall in this continuum and then applying what you need to do in order to nourish yourself, in order to be compassionate towards yourself. So the actual act of doing something is in itself self-compassion.
This is me, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so just going into self-compassion and perfectionism a little bit more. So in this study, Lina and Grabowski, they looked at all the different components of self-compassion and the different components of perfectionism and see how they played or how they affected each other or how they were related, right? So maladaptive perfectionism was associated with significantly lower levels of overall self-compassion. So individuals with maladaptive perfectionism were just less self-compassionate, right? Because of the symptoms we talked about. So this relationship makes sense. And in self-compassion, they looked at the same stuff, self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, the components that I just talked about. And it was also associated with higher levels of negative self-compassion. So the lack of it, self-judgment, isolation, and over-identification, the components I talked about again. But what's interesting for this slide is the last two bullet points. So the first one here, you see concern over mistakes is at odds with common humanity aspect of self-compassion. So for this study, concern over mistakes was defined as like when someone makes a mistake, the preoccupation with that mistake, the judgment that comes from making mistakes, the downward staircase spiral that I was talking about, like I've made a mistake, everything is doomed, like I suck, I'm never gonna, like just the preoccupation with mistakes was greater, right? And this was kind of a clash with the common humanity aspect of self-compassion. Because when we kind of take that common humanity thing and like kind of adopt it and use it, and we make a mistake and it's like, I'm human, I made a mistake, I can make it better, or I won't make this again. Someone else has probably made this mistake. It's so much easier to then like unhook, right? To like get off the back of the negative thought and be like, see you later. Not, I'm just gonna watch you go and not really like take part in this like self-judgment that is about to go down. And on the like same kind of thing, discrepancy was associated with like isolation aspect of negative self-compassion. So discrepancy was a person's like, okay, so they have these goals and their ability to achieve it. That was like in maladaptive perfectionism, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. When we don't really look at our capabilities and just set goals and it's like, we have to get there, the discrepancy gets bigger, right? Like we're less likely to achieve the things we want because we're not checking ourselves for our abilities. And so maybe instead of making a huge goal, we might want to start at like something smaller and work up as we build our capabilities. But when we have this huge gap in like our goal versus abilities, a lot of shame comes up because we're blaming ourselves for not getting to where we should be, when really like we started off by setting ourselves up with failure kind of, but because of that shame, and I talked about how you want to hide, the isolation piece comes, right? It's associated, like you don't want to tell people you've made, oh, bye, Amelia, like thanks for joining us. Yeah, so when we feel shame, it's so hard to like reach out to people to let people know like, hey, I made a mistake here, like, hey, I'm feeling really ashamed here. But those things can actually help us develop self-compassion, because when we do that, we hear, like Chao was saying in that group therapy, we hear how other people have walked the same path and like how they work through it, or looking at them now, they seem happier. We're like, oh yeah, like I could be this, I could be there too. I could get better as well. And I love that like they did the study, because we can see how like maladaptive perfectionism really affects our common humanity, how it makes us feel like we're alone when really we're not, right? Yeah.
I mean, if there's anything that we've learned throughout this pandemic, is that we're all going through some really tough times, and reaching out can be very empowering. And it's a very self-compassionate thing to do. There's a study that was done really recent, 2020 and in 2021, where they looked at, well, what is the link between mindfulness, self-compassion, and perfectionism? Now, although mindfulness is such a core component of self-compassion, it's one of the three, self-compassion is broader in scope than mindfulness because it incorporates sort of an element of self-kindness and self-soothing. and a comforting of oneself. Bill mentioned earlier, it's like, well, compassion is about taking care of others. Self-compassion is, well, if you're taking care of your loved ones, how come you're part of that too?
Yeah.
So putting that onto yourself, right? And self-compassion, as Bill said earlier, is really identifying with your suffering. It actually comes from the word compassion, I think, which means to come with suffering, to be with suffering. I think that's Latin. I think that's what I remember.
I believe you, Chad. I don't know.
No, that's I don't know where the source memory is on that one, but it's somewhere. And yeah, anyways. So what does mindfulness have to do with self-compassion, and how does that relate to self-critical perfectionism, which is SC perfectionism? Well, mindfulness might help individuals actually acknowledge, accept, and remain non-reactive to mental experiences to better regulate their emotions, right? Whereas mindfulness is about the awareness. Self-compassion is about directly targeting the thoughts, those maladaptive perfectionistic thoughts, and fears of failure and fears of personal inadequacy. And over time, self-compassion actually has shown to bolster individuals from negative effects of maladaptive perfectionism. So we've talked a lot about what self-compassion is and what mindfulness is. We're going to start talking about how do we actually do this? Like, how do we actually be more self-compassionate? Great. Makes sense. Self-compassion, good things. Now what?
Okay, so let's look at the barriers to self-compassion, because there are so many barriers. And one of them, the main one, or like one of the first ones that comes up, can be the fusion with unworthiness. And I've kind of like just talked about this throughout the presentation, like hooking, fusing. So when those thoughts come up, like you're worthless, or just feelings of like being worthless, a lot of times we hook onto those thoughts, or we fuse with them, we believe them, right? We get caught up. We take the staircase down, all of those things. What can be helpful is grounding, right? Grounding or mindfulness, or dropping anchor. So noticing what's happening for you right now, watching your thoughts, like, oh, a lot of self-worthless thoughts or like worthless thoughts are coming up for me right now. I'm noticing them. And then you can name the story, like, oh, this is the thought that always comes up when I do something. That gremlin is back. It's telling me I'm not good enough. It's telling me I'm worthless. Like, but it's just a story, right? Because when we call out or recognize our thoughts and be like, I've heard this before, this is just a recorder that keeps playing, it's so much easier to now like choose to unhook or continue hooking, because sometimes it's hard. I totally hear that, but naming the story and recognizing it is like one of the first steps. Another thing is overwhelming emotions, like, oh my God, when you don't achieve your goal, you fail at something, so many emotions come up and it can be so overwhelming. Like, I can't imagine trying to regulate myself when I'm feeling really bad. And so what can we do about that? Noticing, just the mindfulness practice is so important, because when you feel an overwhelming emotion, the time between like where you go down that staircase versus when you're like, oh, I'm at the top of the staircase, increases because you've practiced noticing. So drop anchor, name the feeling, like, oh, I'm feeling lots of shame right now, or like lots of guilt, feeling lots of anger that I didn't do this, right? Naming it, make room for the emotion. So this is one of like, it's a kind of skill. Making room for the emotion is recognizing that all emotions will come and they will go. No emotion lasts forever. So allowing yourself to feel the emotion, and like you can say different things. You can lean into the emotion. You can to notice the emotion and let it come. And so that means maybe being angry for a while, maybe being sad for a while, and sitting with that, not distracting, not reacting, but just sitting with it. Like, I'm really angry right now. Oh, Hannah, thanks for coming. And pace breathing, right? Breathing, because a lot of times when we have overwhelming emotions, if you just check your breathing, you're probably like hyperventilating a little bit or not breathing as deep. So breathing deeply can help you kind of regulate in the moment. These are just like quick things that can be like, that can help you come from a, like, get you back to a place of like regulation. Doubts of usefulness. I think a lot of the times people worry, like, what's the point of self-compassion, right? Like, is it even useful? Will it even help me? So the antidote to that is learning about the benefits of self-compassion. And I say, congratulations, because you're here right now learning about it. So you do know self-compassion is very helpful. There's lots of research to suggest it's helpful. Reminding yourself of those benefits when those thoughts come up, like, what's the point? Like, this is not useful. It's not going to help me. Again, common humanity. People who practice self-compassion do fare better. And reminding yourself of these like facts or like thoughts when the doubts come up can be very helpful to, again, drop anchor, remind yourself of like, this is reality. It is helpful. It can be helpful if I commit to practicing this. Also, sometimes I guess it's kind of touchy-feely, right? Like, I'm talking about loving yourself. I'm talking about self-kindness. And like, yeah, I guess sometimes the vibe is like, oh yeah, like that's so hippie, or like, oh yeah, that's like not not sciencey. But that's why I like provided so many studies. It is helpful, right? And the antidote to that is like self-compassion can look differently from for different people, right? You might not necessarily want to hug yourself, but you can like motivate yourself with like a self-compassion pep talk. It can be like, hey, like you did this. Okay, the kettlebell. I'm just gonna go back to the kettlebell exercise. Like, you didn't reach your goal. That's okay. You're still a worthy person. I don't have to like be like, you're a worthy person, you're loving, everyone loves you, if that's too touchy-feely for you, right? So again, it's like kind of modifying or tailoring what self-compassion can look like for you. And this takes a little bit of practice, figuring out different things. And like maybe self-compassion for you can look like going back to the drawing board, planning new things again, recognizing like this didn't go as well as I should. Maybe self-compassion can be you hugging yourself for an hour because that's what makes you feel loved and makes you want to be kind to yourself. I also have a question here, Chad, from Susie. She asks, how can we encourage healthcare workers who tend to avoid negative emotions to recognize and sit with the emotion? Do you want to take this question?
Yeah. There's two ways about doing this. One is you share your negative emotions with others in a safe, in a trusting way. And a lot of the research shows when it comes down to reducing burnout, especially in the healthcare field, that check-ins in the morning and check-ins in between in sessions and just checking in with people can be very, 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 very helpful in reducing burnout and reducing all those effects of maladaptive perfectionism, right? So that's one thing, is sharing your emotions. The second thing is finding the opportunity to practice mindfulness throughout the day. If someone else isn't checking in on you, how can I check in on myself? So when you ask, how can we encourage healthcare workers to who tend to avoid negative emotions to recognize and sit with the emotions? Sometimes the mirror has to be held up to their face for them to realize, I'm struggling, right? And so trying to find all these opportunities for that mirror to pop up. It's not going to happen right away, but when there's a constant reminder that to check in with yourself, you start realizing that, okay, these negative emotions keep coming back. Avoiding them is not working out for me at this moment. It's actually causing a little bit more trouble. So Tara Brach actually talks about this in terms of radical compassion. It's really doing 180, and instead of avoiding negative emotions, it's really looking at it. This is where it's really important, because when you look at it, you understand it better, right? You first of all, you have to admit to yourself that something's up. Second of all, it's really important to recognize triggers of why this is coming up for you, right? For someone who's perfectionistic, I'm like, I take things personally. Some of my triggers can mean that if I start a new task, I get triggered by like, I need to do this right to begin with, no mistakes. Or if I see someone else, another trigger could be if I see someone else doing better than I am, then I'm like, well, how come I'm not doing better than them? And so I take that even more personally. So you recognize triggers that's happening for you, perfectionism, and the emotions that come after that. What Bill is saying here is when you name the story, really name that story. I found what some of my clients have found helpful is personalizing that story, making it into a person or an object or a thing, something that is a little bit more familiar. This is my I call mine actually a drill sergeant. This is my drill sergeant yelling at me right now. Okay. The next thing is what you just mentioned is sit with it, carry it with you, use it as a source of like, okay, thank you. Thanks for the input. I'm gonna go. So yeah, so to summarize that whole spiel, finding many ways to check in with yourself and also many opportunities to do that. Last week I talked about even washing your hands can be a time for you to recognize them. And the check-ins in the mornings and also at the end of the day. So those can be very helpful. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to Chad's thing too. And I think a lot of the times we're so discouraged to sit with the emotion and feel our emotions because they feel bad. They do feel bad. And sometimes they make us so anxious. They make us feel like we're gonna die, right? Like you're like, if I feel this emotion, like I'm gonna die, or like something bad's gonna happen, or like I'm never gonna get out of it. But I think part of learning to sit with your emotions is accepting that they will come and go. And like going back to times where you felt a certain emotion and it's left, right? Like you don't feel angry right now as you did like maybe 3 weeks ago. And so recognizing like emotions come and go, knowing that you are capable of handling the emotion because you've handled many emotions in the past. And just like kind of letting yourself know like you are safe to experience this emotion can I think be a big step of even starting the practice of sitting with your emotion. Like, I don't know, what do you think, Chad?
Yeah, making space for it. Making space for it. We see that in therapy in terms of like filling in the silence, right? Letting them sit with that emotion. As a healthcare worker, and mental health care worker, we have this quick reflex to problem solve.
Yeah.
There's a term for that called the writing reflex. Notice when you're doing that. Notice when you're very quick to go into problem solving mode right away. Whatever that might look like for you. I'm trying to come up with an example. Oh, I'm sad. Okay, we'll do this then. Sit with that sadness first, right? Just sit with it. Just make space for it and don't and recognize the urge to problem solve right away and slow it down. Mindfulness is just about really slowing it down. You're not making more, you're not spending more time on it. You're just slowing time down. You're just recognizing that, hey, I need to sit with this for a moment. I need to take a breather. And then try to figure out what to do after that. If that makes sense. Okay, so what else barriers do we have? We've learned how to be harsh at some point. We've picked that up, whether it's from society, whether it's from parents, whether it's from teachers. And these are really deeply ingrained scripts that your mind tells you. Your mind might say something like, I have to be tough on myself. That's what stops me from screwing up. Or this is how I motivate myself. Or keep going. Don't be a blank. Think about it this way, right? What motivates donkey better? If you're like, let's say you're on a donkey and you're carrying all this like gear up, I don't know, like up in the desert. What's probably going to motivate that donkey better is a carrot and feeding that and guiding that donkey with the carrot rather than constantly beating it up, right? Over time, the donkey's going to be like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like this is painful. Whereas if you entice them with a carrot, they're going to keep wanting to do that. And also carrots are healthy, right? What's a human equivalent of this? Well, trying to figure out what your values are. Those are your carrots. Those are things that keep you moving, right? When I say values, it's like, how do I want to treat myself in this moment? What do I want to remember myself for? What how do I see myself succeeding in this story, in this predicament that I'm in? What other values do you have? I'm a good brother, I'm a good student, I'm a good teacher, I'm a good nurse, and living by those values and guiding your behavior with those values. Those are your carrots, right? Rather than beating yourself up with harsh self-judgment.
Yeah.
Self-compassion can be quite overwhelming because what we're trying to ask you guys to do is to build this into a routine, right? What I mentioned earlier is like, what is that? How does that check-in look like for you? Constant checking in with yourself. So baby steps. There's a book called Atomic Habits. I'm not going to get into too much into it, but it talks about how do we build habits effectively, and essentially baby steps. That's the bottom line of it. In baby steps, right? And keeping yourself consistent with these practices. When we say always drop an anchor, if you feel overwhelmed, name the story, pace breathing. These are all exercises. Dropping an anchor is like when you're in a ship and you feel like you're in a storm. Dropping an anchor is quite literally, you're not stopping the storm. You're not stopping the shit show that's happening around you. You're just dropping your anchor and you're just finding some sense of groundedness in this chaos, right? You're not embracing the chaos, you're being in the chaos, and well, I guess you are. So that's what we mean by dropping an anchor. Last thing is, and when it comes to barriers for self-compassion, sometimes we don't actually have any experience receiving self-compassion. Some people have had such hard lives that they rarely, if any, have ever received genuine compassion from others. And the antidote to this, and not the only antidote to this, but one of the antidotes to this, is to build positive relationships with people. Recognizing that you're part of this common humanity, you're not in isolation, even though it feels that way. And really finding a sense of community and where you feel, where you want to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Wicked. Okay.
Okay. So just sort of an overview of how we can practice self-compassion. 6 steps, right? Six steps. Okay. So you're now in a situation where you didn't meet your goal, you didn't achieve something you wanted to do, things didn't go the way you had planned to or wanted them to. One of the first things is acknowledging your pain, noticing that right now you're suffering because you didn't get what you wanted. And that's painful, especially if you worked hard for it for such a long time, things didn't go the way you had intended to. That's painful. Acknowledging the pain, dropping anchor, naming the story. So right now I'm feeling this. These are the thoughts that are coming up for me. These are the feelings that are coming up for me. These are the thoughts that I'm having. And then unhooking from self-judgment, the next one, right? Like I just keep saying that. So either you hook and ride on the back of those negative thoughts, or you unhook and let them watch them go away, because they will go away. Thoughts are like that. They come and go. The ones that stay are the ones that we choose to, ride on, right? Either we go down or up with them. And then acting with kindness. So ask yourself, how can I be kind to myself in this moment, right? How can I treat myself with compassion? What can I do to show kindness for myself? Does that mean taking myself out somewhere? Can I sit down and meditate and be with myself and really like show myself that I can handle this? I can be there for myself. Does that mean talking to yourself, being like, giving yourself a pep talk, like, you are great, you are awesome, this is totally okay. Taking yourself out on a walk, taking a break from work, asking yourself what you can do. Because like acceptance, yeah, of the feeling, but we also have to act now, right? So how can you act kind to yourself? And this acceptance piece is what I was saying, like radical acceptance, right? Like accepting every thought, every emotion, everything that's coming up for you without judgment, right? There is no good or bad here. Just let yourself notice everything, memories that are coming up, bodily sensations that are coming up, and making room for them, knowing that like these are normal things to feel, to experience, letting it come and then letting it go. Because a lot of the times when we have thoughts, belief, memories, sensations that come up, we struggle with it, right? We're like, don't feel this way. Stop being sad. Stop being angry. that's when it like gets prolonged, because now you have a feeling about the feeling, and then maybe another feeling about this feeling, and then more thoughts about the feeling. So it doesn't really come and go when really the initial thing, I mean, I can't say for sure, but like, would it then have gone by faster? And would it then have been easier as opposed to struggling with it if you had just let it come and go? Validation, like we validate people around us all the time, right? Like someone screws up, we don't be like, you are a screw up, you suck. We're like, no, of course not. Like these things happen. You tried your best. Um, a friend of yours is struggling, you don't tell them they're an idiot, right? You're like, hey, that's okay. Be kind to yourself. I can help you. Let me listen to you. Validate yourself. That's so okay. You totally deserve to validate yourself. It might feel so weird at first if you're not used to it, but practice, like I was saying, anything gets easier with practice. So practice validating yourself, right? And connectedness. I think this is a pretty big component of self-compassion. It's like one of the favorite things I was telling you about. Unhook from your own self-thoughts. Like, yep, let them come and go, but eventually reach out to people, connect with people, let them know that this has happened. And when you do this, like, in this piece of connectedness, letting yourself receive that compassion from others, letting yourself receive kindness and love from others. If you cannot do it in the moment, it can also be really helpful in like developing self-compassion skills. So connectedness, common humanity, remember, common humanity, we're all human, we all make mistakes, and reaching out to other people can sometimes be quite a healing experience. Sometimes, not everybody, I totally hear that, but sometimes it can be helpful. Anything to add, Chad?
Thank you. So I know we've talked a lot and covered a lot today when it came to self-compassion, perfectionism, and how these all tie in together. If really there's only one thing that I hope you guys take home for today, it would be this acronym. Now this is I'm borrowing this from Tara Brach, which I mentioned earlier, and she wrote a book called Radical Compassion. In it is a skill called RAIN, and it just encompasses all of what Bill and I have already talked about. So the R in RAIN stands for recognize. Mm-hmm. It's being aware to what's going on for you right now. And then once you recognize it, it's almost like there's like a mental like a break that happens. Allow it to come up, right? When we talk about all these things, sit with it, allow it to come up, make space for it. Really, you're buying yourself some time. You're buying yourself some time so that you could come and be familiar with the emotions that are coming up for you. You're opening the door to whatever emotion comes in, right? You're letting it inside your house. You're allowing it to come out. The I in RAIN stands for investigate. Now, I'm not asking you to investigate why this emotion is coming up for you, or what thoughts are coming up for you, or why me, why this, what's going on. That's not what I mean by investigating. When I say investigate, is you're really getting in tune with the body sensations that are happening for you in the moment as you are allowing the emotions to come up, allowing the thoughts and memories to come up. Investigate with curiosity. And we can end it there, but self-compassion is about doing something about it afterwards. And that is the N in RAIN, which is nurture, which is what does my body need in the moment? What do I need to do in this moment? Now, in the next slide, we're going to do, or we don't have time, but there's a lot of meditations out there. I think there's one on YouTube called RAIN. There's a lot of podcasts. If you search for it, Tara Brach and Kirsten Neff are two researchers when it comes to self-compassion. Yeah, and this is the next slide. But we're gonna leave the next 15 minutes or so for questions. Just to give you guys an example of RAIN. it's a really nice acronym because it rains a lot in Vancouver. So it cues your mind up a lot to like, oh, it's raining. Oh, I recognize rain, recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. When you recognize something, I remember when I used to bartend a lot, and it was long shifts, and I'd recognize sometimes when I'm in my fifth hour, I'm like, why am I so like why am I so anxious? Like I'm so restless, right? You allow yourself to feel that. You're like, okay, well, I'm restless. So I recognize that I'm restless. Allowing yourself, well, where do I feel restless? I feel restless in my shoulders, in my chest. My hands are kind of clammy. I investigate, well, that's investigating itself right there. Are you investigating I'm restless? That's what's going on in my body. And nurture, asking yourself that question, what do I need right now in order to feel nurtured? And to be quite honest with you, every time I've experienced that, it's like, I gotta stop drinking coffee and I gotta drink water and I gotta use the bathroom. It's like the last time I went to the bathroom was 5 hours ago. I remember saying this anecdote in the story to a bunch of nurses, and they laughed because they're like, so many times where we've had these moments in our shifts where I'm like, when was the last time I had water?
Yeah.
When was the last time I went to the bathroom? And I'm like, can you honestly ask me or answer this question? They're like, I don't like there's times in my shifts where like I haven't drank water in like 5 hours straight. And I think that's kind of antithetical to being self-compassion. So reminding yourself to have these constant check-ins with yourself, to recognize what's coming up for you, to admit it, to just be like, hey, something's going on. To allow it to come out. Don't deny it. Allow it to come out and investigate what that feels like in your body, and then do something about it, just to nurture it. And it could be as simple as drinking water. It could be simple as going to the bathroom, but it can be as much of a game changer when you practice these skills throughout your shift, throughout your day, and throughout your life, really. All right, we're gonna leave it for questions. In terms of, we also have a webinar survey, which, how do I do this? Which I will put on the chat.
You know what? Maybe I'll put it in the chat because
sure.
like you have the slides open, right? I think
Correct, yes.
Okay.
And we're gonna stay behind for another 15 minutes or so for questions. And if you don't have any questions, feel free to head on out. And Bill and I and the Adler Wellness team appreciate you guys for coming out today. Self-compassion is quite a interesting topic.
I put the thing in the chat, like the link to the webinar survey.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's about it. And then the last page is references.
Sure. Oh, we're done, right? Okay.
Yeah, we're done.